to the motherfucking relay where we're covering today's top boxing news.
Claressa Shields versus Christina Hammer. Let's talk about the fight. You know, there was a lot on the line for both combatants in this fight, and yet they chose to go ahead with the match anyway. Something we need to see more of in men's boxing. Fighters putting it all on the line for legacy, for glory, and the advancement of their own careers. My hat goes off to both Claressa Shields and Christina Hammer for even having the matchup. But as far as how things played out, which is what we're really here to discuss, at first glance, the fight itself looked like a pick'em fight. It being that on either end of the spectrum, you have an unbeaten champion who just so happens to be in their prime. Thus, there really is no blueprint out on either combatant. Those things in mind, it really just boiled down to who do you like for the fight? Myself. In attempting to forecast the outcome of the match, I took a more strategic approach. For me personally, it all boiled down to the styles, because as we all know, styles make fights. And from where I was sitting, Claressa Shields very much has the appearance and characteristics of a pressure fighter. An aggressive, come-forward kind of fighter that wants to mix it up mid-range to inside and land combinations. And with Claressa Shields' very fast hands, educated head movement, and upper body movement, it seemed more likely than not to me, in spite of the fight being hard to edge, at least at first glance, it seemed more likely than not to me that Shields would be the logical choice against Hammer. Hammer, who is very experienced and shows some very good and polished boxing, at the end of the day, has the appearance of a pure boxer. Long range, outside kind of fighter, very good set of legs, educated jab, likes to move around the ring. All the characteristics you expect to see from a pure boxer. But Hammer being a pure boxer and Shields being a pressure style fighter, in a situation like that, in that style matchup, the pressure fighter has the edge. Thus, in that situation, Shields was the logical choice, and it seems that time has proven me right, as we saw on Saturday night. Let's talk about what we saw on Saturday night. A masterful, career-best performance from Claressa Shields. A performance where she didn't leave much to your imagination as far as what she's capable of. Now, in my prediction video, I talked about how Claressa's got the faster hands of the two, and her having those fast hands, that good head movement and upper body movement, it was conceivable to me that even though Claressa's got to get mid-range to inside on a moving target,
good jab,
that likes to keep her opponents on the end of her jab, it's conceivable to me that Shields is going to double up on her jab with those very fast hands. Double up on that jab to keep Christina Hammer on the defensive. Essentially keeping Christina Hammer's gun holstered. Because when you got that many punches coming at you, you're either going to engage the opponent in a shootout or you're going to shell up. Now, we already see from Christina Hammer what she chose to do. She chose to shell up because she's a pure boxer. Mixing it up on the inside is not her forte. Mixing it up on the inside, that's not her preferred range to operate. She likes to keep an opponent at the end of her jab, fighting the majority of the fight from the outside.
Not inside.
Whereas with Shields, she wants to get down and dirty. She wants to get gritty. She wants to get all in your chest and let the fists fly. So as long as Claressa Shields is able to close the gap, she would have the ability to make Christina Hammer very uncomfortable in the process. Now, you may be wondering, well, what happened to Hammer's jab? That jab that normally allows her to fight the fight, the majority of the fight, from the outside. What happened to Christina Hammer's best weapon? I'll tell you what happened to it. Claressa Shields' head movement and hand speed, that's what happened to it. Understand something. It's not that Christina Hammer is a bad fighter, and it's a bit of a stretch to say that she got exposed when, if you've already seen Christina Hammer, know it's not exactly a secret what kind of fight she likes to fight and how you could make a fighter like that uncomfortable. So saying that she was exposed, that's a bit of a stretch. It's not a secret that Christina Hammer's an outside fighter. But if her jab was not as effective with Shields as it is with other fighters, it's because of Shields' head movement and hand speed. That combination
negates the jab.
And Christina Hammer, you've got a fighter who's working off the jab. Everything is off the jab.
Okay.
But what happens when that jab is slipped, or blocked, or parried, or countered? What happens if Claressa Shields steps just out of range of that jab? That effectively negates whatever was going to come after that jab for Christina Hammer. That effectively negates the right hand. If everything you're doing is off the jab, and the jab doesn't land, well, there goes your point of reference for where the right hand should go. In my prediction video, I talked about Claressa Shields' head movement, upper body movement, and hand speed, and how these different things are what put it over the top for me. These were the indications that Shields is the way to go. Shields would be the victor by the end of the fight, because Shields has the right ingredients, the right tools to negate Christina Hammer's best weapon, and that's the jab. You know, if she can't land that jab, she's not going to bring over that right hand, and whether it's a great right hand or a not so great right hand. If you can negate the jab, you'll never get the chance to find out because she's not going to throw it. And if by some chance she gives in to frustration and ends up throwing it anyway, guess what? It's going to be off the mark because you never landed the setup punch, the jab that could have stunned your opponent long enough, had it landed, for them to be in line for the big right hand. Well, that's not going to happen. Not so long as your jab is being negated. And we saw that in this fight with Claressa Shields and Christina Hammer. That is the rhyme and the reason as to why Christina Hammer's jab wasn't doing its job the way it normally does its job. We then look at the pace of the fight, the frequency of occurrences, the frequency of exchanges. How often is Christina Hammer being forced to give up ground? How often is Christina Hammer forced into exchanges? This is the pace of the fight. And what's not immediately visible to the naked eye is that at the pace that this fight is going, at the rate that this fight is going, Christina Hammer is going to end up getting tired. She's going to end up fading because she's not accustomed to having to work at this rate. She's constantly being pressured by a fighter that is negating her best punch while landing a good portion of her own. I mean, you could see by the last, 3 or 4 rounds that Christina Hammer is fading, that it's starting to look like she doesn't even want to be here.
Might go down.
And that's largely in part to the pace of the fight. This, among other things, denotes the Achilles heel that most pure boxers face when squaring off against a pressure-style fighter, a busy fighter, an active fighter, the kind of fighter
It's gonna wear you out.
that is going to constantly force them into uncomfortable situations with their own activity, thereby sapping the energy reserves of that pure boxer.
Make them tired.
So much so that by the midpoint or the late stages of a fight, that pure boxer
is exhausted.
and their offense, well, it's been effectively neutralized, and their defense has been compromised as a result of those sapped energy reserves, as a result of the activity,
Work rate and aggression.
from that pressure fighter. In this instance, from Claressa Shields. Another not so obvious characteristic, skill I should say, that Claressa Shields put on display in this fight is positioning. Good judgment of distance and spacing.
Situational awareness.
This is something that isn't so obvious to the casual observer or the naked eye, but you'll notice that yes, Claressa Shields is very much a pressure fighter, and pressure fighters, they come forward, they're aggressive, but one thing that she has that most other pressure fighters don't have is elite level head movement.
Which we discussed.
More often than not, when you're watching a pressure fighter, a pressure style fighter in action, a fighter that wants to come forward, get off combinations, they're very busy, more often than not, when you see these kinds of fighters, you'll notice that they take a lot of punishment coming through the front door. Your D and C level pressure fighters, even your B level pressure fighters, whereas an A level pressure fighter can apply the same amount of pressure without taking the punishment. It's essentially the difference between, let's say, Arely Musinho and Claressa Shields. Arely Musinho, who was in action the same weekend, and Arely Musinho, who found herself in trouble in spots due to eating some very hard punches, some hard shots, while in the process of trying to deliver shots of her own. Whereas Claressa Shields, she was able to get off her combinations, she was able to close the gap and get within range to land those punches without taking the punishment, without getting nailed coming through the front door. Head movement.
Distance and spacing.
Claressa Shields has got it, and it is elite level head movement.
Distance and spacing.
I'll say that this was a masterclass. A masterclass performance on the part of Claressa Shields, who effectively advances to the number 2 spot on the Women's Ring IQ pound for pound list. Now we move on to the pound for pound segment of the conversation. With Claressa Shields having defeated Christina Hammer, that effectively bumps Christina Hammer off the list. It being that the rules that govern the list itself dictate that no fighter absent of a world title and no fighter coming right off a loss is allowed to maintain a spot on this list. Thus, a vacant spot becomes available, and 2 Division WBO Bantamweight champion Daniela Bermudez emerges in the the number 6 spot of the Ring IQ pound for pound list, ahead of Barbie Juarez, who Daniela Bermudez beat several fights ago. Just as well, Daniela Bermudez holds a career highlight victory over Tigresa Acuña. Tigresa Acuña, who Daniela Bermudez traveled up in weight to defeat,
her IBF title,
but ultimately returned to the bantamweight division, where she currently holds the WBO title. Now back to Claressa Shields. You may be wondering, why is she occupying the number 2 spot? Why not number 1? After having defeated Christina Hammer for all the belts and what is being characterized as the biggest fight in women's boxing, how could she not be seated at number 1? Why number 2? I'll tell you why.
pay attention.
Claressa Shields' high-profile victory this weekend, and it's quite an accomplishment, it really is, having become an undisputed champion in so few professional fights.
Only 9 fights.
But as big as that accomplishment is,
Now quickly she got there.
the fighter seated ahead of Claressa Shields, Cecilia Brækhus, well, she's already been there and done that. I mean, yes, it's quite an achievement to become an undisputed champion, and given how quickly Claressa Shields got to that accomplishment, how quickly she got to that point,
Why she's on the list.
it is amazing. But in doing so, you're not doing anything that Cecilia Brækhus hasn't done already. Understand that in the realm of unifying world titles and becoming an undisputed champion, there, Claressa Shields has caught up to Cecilia Brækhus. But in the realm of title defenses, in the realm of quality of competition and the fighter's overall track record, it is there that Cecilia Brækhus far exceeds anything that Claressa Shields has done so far. Mostly because Claressa only has 9 fights.
Only 9.
It's a wonder that in only 9 fights she could have come this far. So that's not said to disparage her in any way.
Not at all.
That's not said to denigrate Claressa Shields and any of the fighters that she's fought. It's not like that. But it's more along the lines of when you've got a fighter that only has, let's say, 9 professional fights, and in those non-professional fights, that particular fighter has achieved quite a bit. Achieved the kind of accomplishments that would take an average fighter a much longer time to get to.
Okay.
In that way, their rank on a pound-for-pound list is justified by what they've put forth so far. But as they approach that upper echelon, that upper crust on the list, what that fighter might find is that, yes, you've got some accomplishments.
Big ones.
But the person ahead of you has some of the same accomplishments that you do and some that you don't. That their body of work is more robust than yours. Thus, the argument for them to be seated ahead of you, well, there's a lot more credibility to it. Let's cross-compare some things in regards to Claressa Shields and Cecilia Brækhus. Claressa Shields has fought some great fighters, given how few professional fights she has. Most other fighters out there are nowhere near squaring off against an undefeated champion in only 9 professional fights, whereas Claressa Shields, she squared off with at least 2 undefeated champions, Nikki Adler, Christina Hammer. She also squared off against an undefeated former champion in Tori Nelson. Those are big, big names for a fighter that only has 9 professional fights. Those are big names to have already racked up on a resume. Big scalps. But those big scalps pale in comparison with some of the names that you can find on Cecilia Brækhus' resume. Let's cross-compare those names. Let's cross-compare Tori Nelson, Nikki Adler, Christina Hammer to some of the names that you can find on Cecilia Brækhus' resume. For an undefeated Tori Nelson, I can raise you an undefeated Ina Sagaidakovskaya. I can raise you an undefeated Michaela Lauren, an undefeated Lucia Morelli, an undefeated Oxandia Castillo. The same Oxandia Castillo who took Hannah Gabriel's O by knocking her the fuck out in her first fight. After knocking out Hannah Gabriel's, who do you think Oxandia Castillo squared off against? Cecilia Brækhus. And what do you think happened when they fought? I'll tell you what happened when they fought. A 9th round TKO stoppage that saw Cecilia Brækhus ragdolling Oxandia Castillo. The name of Oxandia Castillo is a bigger and better and more credible name than either the names of Tori Nelson or Nikki Adler. Vinny Skovgaard, yet another fighter that was undefeated up until the point she shared the ring with, guess who? Cecilia Brækhus. We then cross-compare the name of Christina Hammer, what is arguably the biggest name on Claressa Shields' resume.
It is.
With one of the bigger names on Cecilia Brækhus' resume, Sophie Ann Mathies. What is arguably the biggest, if not one of the biggest, punchers the sport of women's boxing has ever seen. A fighter who had a professional record of 26 wins with 22 knockouts.
2 losses.
At the time, she squared off against Cecilia Brækhus. In the first fight, Cecilia beat her on points. In the second fight, Cecilia ragdolled her the same way she ragdolled Oxandia Castillo. Understand that this is no small feat. Sophie Ann Mathies is one of the most devastating punchers the sport of women's boxing has ever seen. And if you want a testament to that, just go back and see what she did to Holly Holm in their first fight. In that first Holly Holm versus Sophie Ann Mathies fight, that fight itself produced one of the most brutal knockouts the sport of women's boxing has ever produced. Yet that ability to completely annihilate an opponent with sheer punching power was absent when that same Sophie Ann Mathies fought Cecilia Brækhus, not just once, but twice. I mean, for perspective, if perspective is what you're looking for, well, those 3 names, Nikki Adler, Tori Nelson, Christina Hammer, those are the biggest names on Claressa Shields' resume. Those 3 names are the biggest testament to just how skilled a fighter she is. And they are credible opponents. But those credible opponents really do pale in comparison with some of the fighters that you can find on Cecilia Brækhus' resume. And guess what? That's not all that's there. There's still the name of Mia St. John, Chris Namis, Chevelle Hallback, Callie Reese, Jessica Balogun, Jennifer Retzke, Erika Farias, Clarice Venson. The list goes on. Essentially what I'm getting at is these fighters, they got some of the same accomplishments, but one fighter's body of work, one fighter's overall track record is far more robust than the other. So the argument for Claressa Shields to unseat Cecilia Brækhus as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, well, that argument is not quite there yet. And that while there may be some surges after Saturday night's fight of people declaring Claressa Shields as the #1 female pound-for-pound fighter in the world, what you're gonna find is that a lot of boxing fans are slaves to the moment. Slaves to the moment who become short-sighted with what's hot and what's now. But anyone with actual knowledge of both of these fighters' careers and the fighters that they've fought, comprehensive knowledge, anyone with this knowledge will agree that Shields is not quite there yet to unseat Cecilia Brækhus as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world.
Not yet.
And that the pound-for-pound itself is more of a marathon than it is a sprint. That the overall track record of Cecilia Brækhus in 35 professional fights, 35 professional wins, 0 losses with 0 draws. Her overall track record and the longevity that she's exhibited over the years, that far exceeds anything that Claressa Shields has even had the opportunity to show so far. Claressa's on the right track, and it's conceivable that sometime in the future, she may just unseat Cecilia Brækhus. But as it stands today, based on Saturday's contest, she's not quite there yet. Those eggs need more bacon.